Back in 2013, that's pretty kind of crooked, ain't it? A young boy was found dead here at this high school that you see right behind me, Lowndes High School. His death was initially ruled an accident, but in the years since, new evidence has come out and his body was exhumed and new autopsies were performed, and there has been a heated debate going among the people and across the media whether this was an accidental death or whether this young kid was murdered. Today, I'm here in Valdosta, Georgia, and I'm going to talk about this case, and I'm going to show you some of the evidence, and we're going to talk about some of the things that happened since his death, and then you guys can decide for yourself, do you think this was an accident, or was this cold-blooded murder? This is the death of Kendrick Johnson. "17-year-old Kendrick Lamar Johnson, he lived here in Valdosta with his family, and he went to school right here at Lowndes County High School. Everyone, his friends and family and all, they described Kendrick as a sweet and a quiet boy who made friends with just about anyone he encountered. Kendrick was actually rare in that he was a gifted three-sport athlete. He played football, basketball, and track, but he was mostly known for his skills playing basketball and football. Kendrick's dream was to actually become a professional football player. Now, although Kendrick was friendly with most, just months before Kendrick's death, there was an incident right here at the high school. And what happened is the varsity and JV football teams were traveling to Grayson for football games one night. And that night, Kendrick's team, he was on the JV team, they won their football game. And then the varsity team actually lost their game that night. On the bus after the games, one of the varsity players, he was in a bad mood after his loss. His name was Brian Bill. He went up to Kendrick and tried picking a fight. And they both argued and they swapped your mama jokes with each other. And the kids around them on the bus say that Kendrick actually got the upper hand on them then. So the bus was stopped and Kendrick and Brian were made to get off, and they were told they had to ride back with their parents. Well, Brian's parents went to the game, but Kendrick's didn't. So Brian got to ride back with his family, but Kendrick actually rode in the front seat of a Lowndes County Sheriff's deputy's car who had traveled with the team for the game for safety. Once everyone made it back here to the school, Brian Bell again approached Kendrick and threatened to fight him. So the two of them, they got into this fight. The police were called to intervene, but they all say that Kendrick got the upper hand again and actually embarrassed Brian Bell in front of his whole team, in front of everybody that was here. So Kendrick was taken home that night in the Lowndes County Sheriff's car. And there was a report written, but it was just considered a shoving match between kids and nothing ever came up. Now, after this, several months pass, football season ends, and the students get out for a 2-week break for Christmas and New Year's, okay? January 10th of 2013, it was just a normal day here at Lowndes County High School. Students had just returned from their break just days prior, and all the students, including Kendrick, came to school that morning, and they went to all their classes that day. Kendrick is on the security cameras coming in, and then he's on cameras again in the lunchroom in line to get his lunch. And then again, he's on camera at 1:20 entering the gym for his physical education class. You can see on the videos that Kendrick and all of the other kids are playing basketball, and some of the kids are sitting on the bleachers, and they're all just having a good time. It's just a typical afternoon for everyone. But this image right here of Kendrick on the school security camera, this would be the last time Kendrick Johnson was seen alive, but obviously no one knew that at the time. After the third block ends, everyone leaves the gym and they head to their fourth block classes. Well, Kendrick was actually marked absent from his fourth block class that day. And surprisingly, no one came forward and said to anyone that they had seen him earlier in the day, and no one came forward and wondered, it's like, hey, Kendrick was here. I talked to him earlier. I don't know where he's at. No one said anything. But it wasn't until a few hours after school had gotten out that Kendrick's parents actually began to worry, because the clock just kept ticking, but Kendrick hadn't come home yet. And later in the evening, as Kendrick's family become increasingly more concerned with every minute that was passing, they got in their car and they drove here to the high school to see, just to make sure that Kendrick wasn't still here practicing. And when they got here, there was no sign of him. The basketball team and color guard had been in the gym here practicing until late into that evening, but by the time Kendrick's family got here, they were all gone. So it's at this point, it's real late in the evening, they couldn't find Kendrick anywhere, and they're real worried about him. So this very same night of Kendrick's disappearance, they contact law enforcement and they report him missing.
911, where's your emergency?
Yes, I'm calling. My son had didn't come home from school today, and he still haven't got here.
Okay, what's your son's name?
Kendrick Johnson.
Well, law enforcement puts out an APB for Kendrick, and they rode around looking for him, but it was just so late in the evening at this point, there just wasn't a whole lot they could do. So they basically just had to make plans and prepare and wait for the sun to come up to really start looking for him. As the sun came up here in Valdosta on January the 11th of 2013, detectives knew that the last Kendrick's family knew Kendrick was here at Lowndes County High School. So first thing that morning, detectives are here at the high school waiting for the office staff to arrive so that they could review all the school's security camera footage and see if Kendrick had even ever left the school, and if he did leave, who did he leave with? Pretty quickly that morning, they start reviewing all the footage from the day prior. It took them a few hours, but they watched the videos all the way up until after the color guard team finished around 9 p.m. that night, and they never saw Kendrick leave the school. So it's about the same time that morning, it's about 10 a.m. Students who were here in the gym, they were in there for their physical education class, and they were playing basketball, and they were doing their stuff. And well, a lot of students, they would bring extra shoes and extra clothes and stuff to change into. And rather than buy a locker and pay that money, they would just take their stuff over into the corner of the gym where they kept wrestling mats and equipment and that kind of stuff. They would take their shoes and stuff and they would just hide them over there somewhere until the class ended. That day, one of the girls who was in the gym, when she first got there, she had tossed her shoes up over onto these wrestling mats, and at the end of class she went to get them. So she climbs up the pile of mats and she notices a foul smell. She continues looking for her shoes, and when she found her shoes, she got the shock of her life. When this girl looked down into the rolled up wrestling mats, not only did she see her shoes, but she also saw feet sticking up. So this student immediately jumped down off the mats, and she went and she told an adult about what she had seen. And this teacher, whoever he was, he quickly cleared the gym out and immediately went and got sheriff's deputies who were here at the school looking for Kendrick. These deputies went straight to the gym and they immediately confirmed that yes, there is a person stuck in the wrestling mats, and they checked for a pulse and they confirmed that this person was deceased. So the gym was shut down and a crime scene unit was called in to come investigate. They started off by laying the wrestling mat down, and they noted that on the floor, right at the bottom of the mat, right where that center hole would have been, there was a single basketball shoe, and then there was a puddle of blood next to the shoe. They unrolled the mat, and they confirmed that this was the deceased body of 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson. Kendrick was stuck in the middle of this wrestling mat. The whole mat was about 6 foot tall, and he was kind of like right in the middle of it with his head facing down. One of his arms was stretched out above his head, facing the floor as if he were reaching something, and the other arm was down around his waist, or facing up around his waist. He wasn't wearing any shoes at the time. He only had on socks. Now, up at the top around his feet, there was an additional pair of shoes, and this belonged to that student who found him. She had, just by chance, out of all the mats that were there, she had tossed her shoes into the exact mat that Kendrick was stuck in, and this was just a crazy coincidence. Now, by the time that they found Kendrick's body, it had been nearly 21 hours since Kendrick had gone missing, meaning he had been stuck in this upside-down position the entire time. So when investigators laid the mat down and unrolled it, Kendrick's face was very swollen and very bloated to the point that it was beyond recognition. All of the blood that was in his whole body had ran to his head, facing downward, and it had pooled up in his head to the point where blood started coming out of his facial orifices, and this is where the blood came from that was on the ground by his shoe. Kendrick's mom was actually here at the high school on campus first thing that morning when the police found Kendrick, but she said that she was never allowed to see him and she was never even allowed to even get close to where he was throughout the whole investigation. Another thing is that the gym was shut down to preserve evidence and for law enforcement to investigate, but the school here was not placed on lockdown. So all of Kendrick's classmates and friends were just here on campus having to go to classes and act like it was just another normal day while their friend was just found dead in the building right next to it. It's kind of crazy. And on top of that, once law enforcement finished investigating, they called in a cleanup crew to clean up the blood and all of that stuff, and all of that was done while school was in session here. Kendrick's body was taken to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's medical examiner for an autopsy. The next morning, within 24 hours of Kendrick being discovered, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office put out a statement saying that although it was still an open investigation and that they were still waiting on the autopsy and forensic reports and all of that to come back, that so far it appeared as if Kendrick had willingly went into this wrestling mat in the center of it to try and retrieve his shoe, and then he had gotten stuck, and they said he probably burrowed himself further in there, wiggling around to try to escape, and it made it worse for him, and he got to the point where he couldn't breathe. He probably tried to call out for help, but because he was face down in this thick wrestling mat, no one could hear him, and he stayed stuck in that upside down position for 24 hours, and this led to all the blood rushing to his head, and they say he eventually suffocated to death because of this. His exact cause of death was listed as positional asphyxia. Now, while law enforcement waited on the autopsy and the test results to come back, detectives combed through all the school's video footage. They scoured through the gym and all of the evidence, looking for anything that seemed suspicious. During the investigation, about 2 weeks after Kendrick's death, the sheriff's office received an anonymous tip that claimed Kendrick Johnson was actually killed by a fellow student named Brian Bell, who, if you remember, that was the student who he had gotten in the fight with. As investigators were trying to check into this anonymous tip, rumors started swirling around the high school. Multiple different rumors about different people. And because this is high school, those rumors then morphed into other stuff, and they spread fast through the school. Now, these rumors did get back to investigators, and as they were looking into them, they were led to a student here at the high school named Dalton. Now, this Dalton guy was apparently just a stick that liked to stir the pot. So detectives went to Dalton to see if he actually did know anything or if it was just all BS. And if it was BS, they wanted him to come clean about all these different stories that he had told. But when officers sat down with Dalton, he gave police a whole new story naming 2 other guys that really didn't even know Kendrick. That story came back to be BS as well. So they went back to Dalton and they arrested him and charged him with giving false statements to law enforcement. Now, I don't think we will ever find out why this Dalton guy decided to just tell a bunch of crazy stories. It hindered the investigation. Maybe it was just for attention, but I mean, who knows? So after all of this has happened, the test results and everything finally get back, and the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office come out again, and they doubled down on their conclusion that this was just a horrific accident and that there was no foul play involved. Now, something about this just didn't sit right with Kendrick's family, though. From the very beginning, they had a hard time believing the version of events that the Sheriff's Office had concluded. Kendrick's family was very vocal in the news and in the public spotlight that they thought foul play was involved and that they didn't trust the Sheriff's Department. They were so vocal that it eventually got the attention of the mainstream media organizations, and all of them started running the story and talking about Kendrick's death. And for weeks and weeks, that was all they talked about.
The body was found in the gym at Lowndes County High School early Friday morning.
One thing that really made the family upset was that a couple of months after Kendrick's death, but just before the initial investigation wrapped up, the school began renovating the gym here, the version of the gym that you see now. It used to look different than it does now. Law enforcement had finished investigating inside of the gym, and they cleared it But this really upset the family, and they sent in a letter from their lawyer to the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office telling them to force the school to stop the renovations on the gym immediately, saying that they were destroying things that could be valuable evidence. Now, the Sheriff's Office responded that they have cleared that gym of all of its evidence and that it was no longer needed for the investigation. Now, this renovation wasn't something that come about because of Kendrick's death or anything. It had been planned for a long time prior to this. It was just that I guess the family felt like it should have been postponed for a while longer. All of the distrust that the family had on this investigation, as I said, it didn't sit right with them. So in June of 2013, Kendrick's family paid to have his body exhumed from his resting place right here. This is the same spot. His family paid to have his body exhumed so that a second autopsy could be done on his remains. This time the autopsy was being done at a non-state-run forensics lab, Forensics Dimensions in Heathrow, Florida. The second autopsy brought this whole story back out into the news media spotlight again when the results came in, and this private pathologist the family hired determined that Kendrick died from blunt force trauma to his head and neck. He suggested that Kendrick's death was non-accidental. That's not even what dominated the headlines. It was announced that when this private pathologist received Kendrick's remains, all of his major organs were missing, and that his body was stuffed with newspaper ads. There was Black Friday sale papers and JCPenney ads shoved inside Kendrick's body. Now, the media went nuts over this, nonstop talking about it for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. They talked about the newspaper thing even more than the pathologist saying that he believed Kendrick died from a blunt force trauma. Now, along with exhuming Kendrick's remains and doing the second autopsy, the family had their lawyer get all of the police investigation files, and the family released to the media that the initial law enforcement investigation was heavily flawed. Law enforcement had initially found blood splatter on a wall about 40 feet away from the mat that Kendrick was stuck in. The report said that law enforcement tested this blood and that it did not belong to Kendrick, so they didn't relay this information to the family because the detectives didn't think it was related. Police also found a bloody tissue in a trash can right near the women's restroom in the gym, and the report says it was also tested, and it was also determined not to belong to Kendrick. So again, it wasn't disclosed to anyone. In the gym, laying near where Kendrick's body was, there was a Hollister brand shirt and a shoe that were both taken. They were both tested and determined that they didn't belong to Kendrick. So those items were just discarded and not kept in with evidence. On top of that, Kendrick had like cuts and blood and stuff on his hands where it almost looked like he had been involved in some kind of physical altercation. Law enforcement said in a statement when asked about all of this that there is over 3,000 people that go to school or work here at Lowndes County High School, and that it was absolutely impossible to get search warrants to test everyone here at the school to find out who exactly the bloody tissue and the blood on the wall belonged to, and that they had no reason to test the blood further once they confirmed it was not Kendrick's. Now, after all of this came out, Kendrick's family hired notable civil rights attorney Ben Crump for help, and they filed a lawsuit against the funeral home and the director of Harrington Funeral Home here in Valdosta for Kendrick's organs being missing and then his body being stuffed with newspaper. The funeral home director claimed that they never received Kendrick's organs from the GBI medical examiner, and that even if they did, it's their practice to usually discard of the organs to keep them from decomposing faster in the body, causing a smell. So they would take the organs out and fill it with whatever material. In this case, it was newspaper, but also so that the body kept its original shape. If his chest was sunk in or if there was a bad smell, it would have been prevalent at a funeral service. The funeral home said that, usually this information just doesn't get out to the public, but it's a normal practice. And The people weren't buying that. So a subsequent investigation was done into the funeral home by the Georgia Secretary of State, and they concluded that the funeral home did not follow what they would call a best practice, and they said that it is not consistent with the standards of care in the industry, and they said that there were other suitable materials that they could use in this situation rather than newspaper, but that they ultimately did not violate any laws, and the funeral home was cleared of any wrongdoing. Now, that lawsuit against the funeral home, it was in the court system for about a year, and for whatever reason, the family dismissed the lawsuit against Harrington Funeral Home. Now, as time passed, Kendrick's family never gave up on their claims that Kendrick was murdered. They got louder and louder in the news, and they went online discrediting the sheriff's department and their investigation, to the point that the sheriff himself got fed up with it, and he came out and said that he would pay $500,000 out of his own pocket if someone could provide the evidence that Kendrick was murdered. This was done not in hopes that someone would actually come forward and provide evidence. He did it just to show how confident he was in their conclusion that this was just an accident. And, you know, so far to date, no one has been able to come forward and collect on that $500,000. Kendrick's family would go on and they would hire private investigators, and they had multiple lawyers digging into all of the evidence. And in 2015, Kendrick's family filed another lawsuit, but this time it was against a couple of Kendrick's schoolmates. Remember earlier in the story when I talked about how Kendrick got into that fight with the varsity football player? Well, the Johnson's family's lawyer discovered that this kid, Brian Bell, and his brother, Brandon, their father was actually an FBI agent. Apparently, at some point during the initial investigation, an audio file was presented to law enforcement that they claimed was Brian Bell confessing to killing Kendrick. Now, the sheriff's department investigated this audio file and confirmed that it was fabricated. What happened was, a young man contacted the Johnsons claiming to be Brian Bell's second cousin. This male told the Johnsons that he had this confession that he secretly recorded of Brian, and then he offered to sell it to them for $1,000. Well, the Johnsons were wanting so bad to find the evidence they needed to prove that their son was murdered. So they met with this young man and they paid him the $1,000, and he gave them this audio file. Detectives sent that file off to the GBI Forensic Analysis Unit, and they tested all of the voices on it and where it came from, and they confirmed that it was not Brian or Brandon on that tape. Law enforcement even discovered that Brian Bell didn't even have a second cousin that was male, as this person who came forward claimed. So, someone who is apparently heartless here, they chose to take advantage of the Johnson family at this particular moment in time, a time when their son has just died, and a time when they're so focused on getting justice for him that they really haven't even been able to properly grieve. And, you know, it takes a special kind of person to do that to them in that moment, to get $1,000 out of them. It's crazy. Despite the GBI saying the audio file was unequivocally faked, Kendrick's family felt that it was real. So all of this led to the family filing a $100 million lawsuit, and in it they theorized that Brian and Brandon Bell, they killed Kendrick, and that their father, who was an FBI agent, was working with the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, the Valdosta Police Department, the City of Valdosta, the Lowndes County School District, and a couple of GBI officials, and that they were all working together to cover up Kendrick's murder. The lawsuit also claimed that all of those agencies I just mentioned were also all working in conjunction with the funeral home director, and that this funeral home purposely discarded Kendrick's organs to cover up the murder. Part of this lawsuit was based on the surveillance footage from the day that Kendrick went missing. You can see on that footage, both Brian and Brandon Bell were at the gym, and they were on the cameras, and you see Brian entering wearing one shirt, and when he leaves, he's wearing a different shirt. Now, it's claimed that he took off the shirt and wore just his undershirt as he was leaving to hide that it might have gotten blood on it. during the murder. But that this footage was actually from many hours before Kendrick ever even went to the gym. In fact, the footage of the Bell brothers going into the gym was from very early on in that morning, and Kendrick didn't go to the gym that day until after 1 o'clock. It was 1:20 p.m. when he went to the gym. So the sheriff said from the time that Kendrick went into the gym until the next day when he was found, neither one of the two Bell brothers were anywhere near the gym. Brandon, in fact, had even left the school before lunch that day, and he was on a school wrestling trip in Macon, Georgia, and they actually stayed the night in Macon, so he was nowhere near the school. And Brian was actually on camera. He was in class for his third and fourth block classes that day, and he's not on camera anywhere going anywhere near the gym, which kind of seems to put the nail in the coffin on whether or not the Bell brothers killed Kendrick or not. But no, the lawsuit claims that they did it, and basically one of those departments that I just listed, either that or all of them, they must have deleted any footage that showed the brothers going near the gym and killing Kendrick. But what is not debatable is that from the very beginning, Brian and his brother, he refused to talk, and they lawyered up. And Brian Bell has stood firm this entire time that he never saw Kendrick that day. All right, well, Brian lied to everyone. He lied to law enforcement. He even went on the news media and lied to the whole world when he said he never saw Kendrick that day, and there's clear proof that he did.
Did you see Kendrick that day?
No. I did not.
The lawsuit actually alleged that this FBI agent actually encouraged his two sons to attack Kendrick. It says that Kendrick must have been lured into the corner of the gym that afternoon by a female conspirator named Taylor. After Taylor lured Kendrick to the corner of the gym, the brothers must have jumped him and they beat him to death with a weight, and then afterwards they must have rolled him up inside of the wrestling mat and then left. Now, after this lawsuit was filed in Superior Court, the claims in it were so shocking that it forced the sheriff's office to come out once again, and they just stood firm on their assessment that it was just an accident. This was just a freak accident. They even said at this time that Kendrick and Brian Bell really didn't even have any animosity against each other like the parents claim. The sheriff said that they interviewed over 100 students who said that they had their disagreement that night a while back, but since then they had squashed their beef with each other, and that they had even worked on a project together for one of their classes between the time of the fight and Kendrick's death. Nevertheless, by the time everything was filed in court, Kendrick's family had this lawsuit against all of those agencies I mentioned. They had another lawsuit against the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office alone. They had 2 wrongful death lawsuits against the Lowndes County School District, and then they had another lawsuit against the funeral home. At the end of all of this lawsuit drama, some of the cases were dismissed and some were dropped, and after it was all said and done, a judge actually ordered Kendrick's family to pay back $292,000 in legal fees to all of those parties that they sued, because these people had to hire lawyers and pay money to defend themselves and all of this stuff. So they ordered Kendrick's family to pay almost $300,000 to cover all of that. Even after all of this, and even after they were ordered to pay all this money, Kendrick's family still never gave up, and they remained committed that Kendrick was murdered and that they were going to prove it. The family was so certain that Kendrick had been murdered that they actually staged like a walk-in kind of thing, and they had a big group of people. They all walked up to the courthouse and they linked arms, standing in front of the courthouse doors, not letting anyone in and anyone out. They were protesting, trying to get the case reopened, and law enforcement actually had to put their hands on them and physically force them out of the way, and they were taken inside, and a few of them were arrested that night. Those charges were dropped later on, but that got the eyes of Michael Moore, and in 2016, because of all of this, the Department of Justice decided that they would reopen the investigation into Kendrick's death.
I am of the opinion that a sufficient basis exists for my office to conduct a formal review of the facts and investigation surrounding the death of Kendrick Johnson.
Hallelujah! Thank you, Jesus! Thank you, Jesus! Justice for KJ is coming!
damage.
So the Department of Justice decided to take a look at it, and they exhumed Kendrick's body again for a third time. And this time, the autopsy was going to be done by a military medical examiner, someone with no affiliation to law enforcement or Kendrick and his family, just a neutral person. The Department of Justice investigators, they went through 17 boxes of files and evidence. They talked to everyone involved all over again. They even re-interviewed Brian Bell, his brother, and Brian's girlfriend Taylor. In fact, at this point, by the time this DOJ investigation was going on, Brian had graduated, and then he was initially accepted into Florida State University. And then he posted on his social media that during this DOJ investigation, it was like 5 a.m. in the morning, a SWAT team busted into his dorm room, and they took his cell phone and his computers and all this as they were investigating. And they did it like this, of course, to catch them all off guard so they couldn't delete anything. Now, it wasn't known to anyone at this point, but we did find out later that at this time of those SWAT raids, a couple of people had come forward over the past couple of years since Kendrick's death, and they all claimed that they were told firsthand that Brian had killed Kendrick. After all of this, the Department of Justice investigation ended months after it started, and the results were that there was insufficient evidence to conclude that another party was involved in Kendrick's death, and that the DOJ was labeling it as an accidental death, just like the first investigation. This was yet again another crushing blow to Kendrick's family. Throughout all of this, they wanted so bad to hear that Kendrick had been murdered. But again, even though they didn't get the answer they wanted, they still didn't let it stop them. They remained vocal that they believed Kendrick was murdered and that they wanted justice for him. So a few years later, in 2020, once again, because of the public outcry, Kendrick's case was again reopened and reinvestigated by a new sheriff of Lowndes County. They did not do another autopsy because they had already been 3, but they did go over all of the case files and all of the evidence. And this new investigation was making headlines all over the mainstream media, and people were hoping that Kendrick's family might get the answers that they wanted this time. The family spoke out to reporters and said that they were happy to have new eyes looking at Kendrick's case. But once again, though, months later, this third investigation ended, and it concluded that Kendrick just died in a freak accident. Now, because they had been through this so many times with the same outcome, the Lowndes County Sheriff basically came out and said that Kendrick's family has had the answers as to what happened all along. They've just chosen not to accept it. And then the sheriff gave information that was pretty damning, and he released that during this investigation, they had evidence that someone sent a couple of students a text, and they offered them money to lie during their interview to accuse Brian Bell of this. Both of these students failed to take the money, and they told the truth about what they knew, and they both told the investigators about the text messages they received. So the sheriff said on record that there was clear attempts to influence the outcome of this new investigation in a way that just didn't fit the evidence. It was clear to everyone that Kendrick's family was hurt. They were hurt by Kendrick's death, and they clearly didn't get the answers that they wanted by the initial investigation. This, mixed with a heavy distrust for law enforcement, just led to all of this that took place after Kendrick's death. Now, here we are. It's been 11 years since Kendrick's death. Almost to the day, actually. January 10th was, like a week ago now, a little bit more than a week ago. And I wanted to have this done up on the 10th, but I got held up waiting on some of the evidence videos. On top of Kendrick's family losing Kendrick, the Bells and Taylor, they've lost everything too, because they were named publicly. The mainstream media posted online that they were murderers, and Ebony Magazine actually did a whole expose on how the Bells and Taylor were getting away with murder here. So this led to Florida State University actually withdrawing Brian's football scholarship because of all the accusations, claiming that it would cause negative press for the school. If they didn't do this, they've had their lives ruined, and it's not going to change. Now, again, if they did do it, it's all justified, and it should be a lot worse. Now, I saw while I was researching this case and everything about it that Brian Bell and Taylor the two people that have been a big part of this story, they were sued and publicly flogged, and they've been accused by the court of public opinion. But I saw that even after all of this, they just recently got married. Now, more than a decade has passed since Kendrick's death. And after all this time, Kendrick's family still believe that Kendrick was murdered by Brian and Brandon and Taylor. They still stand outside of the courthouse holding signs up and banners. No matter how many times they're told it's just a freak accident, they stand out there protesting that they want justice for Kendrick. In fact, they're still so confident in that he was killed that just a few months ago now, back in September of 2023, Kendrick's parents filed yet again another lawsuit, even after what happened the last time and them having to pay back all that money. They filed another lawsuit, and this time the lawsuit is against the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office again. And this lawsuit claims that both of those agencies inserted false information into the investigation just so that the investigation would be classified an accident instead of a murder. So when this new lawsuit was filed, it was a big story again, and it made it all in the news networks. This lawsuit is still currently in the court system now, so we're going to have to wait to find out what will come of it. After hearing all the evidence, I don't know if Kendrick was killed or if it was just a freak accident as it is labeled. Like, I can see valid points on both sides of the argument. So I want to know what you guys think. What happened to Kendrick Johnson? You can tell me what you think down in the comments below. I mean, just based on that, there's things that you can point to on both sides, so it probably means that we're all going to have different opinions about what happened. One thing we can say, though, a lot of people have suffered because of all of this, most obviously Kendrick Johnson and his family. And then, as I said earlier, if the Bells were not involved in this, was an accident, their lives have been ruined too. And on top of that, the whole community has been affected by this, because where some believe it was an accident, some believe he was murdered. But then if you have friends or family that feel the opposite way than you do, then they're constantly arguing about it. And then I'm not oblivious to the fact that there is also a racial division that has come from all of this, as if we needed any more help, where everyone is kind of encouraged to stay on one side or the other based on your ethnicity. It literally really has split the city right down the middle, just like politics does. It's wild. Now, unfortunately for the Johnsons, or the Bells, really, I don't have the answers as to what really happened that day. I don't know how this should play out from here, but what I do know is that this is just tragic all the way around for everybody. Now, that is going to do it for this video today from here in Valdosta, Georgia at Lowndes County High School. I want to thank you all so much for watching. You just don't know how much I appreciate it. If you're new here, go down, hit that subscribe button, then hit that notification bell so you get notified every time I upload a video. Thank you all. I will see you again in the next one. Please, all of you, stay safe and stay healthy. Much love to you all.